where are we in this whole process? I get the feeling that, Trump's just kind of washing his hands of the whole thing. Russia doesn't want to sit down and negotiate. Ukraine wants more than they can ever hope to get in their negotiations. And is Trump just going to turn the whole thing over to the NATO allies and the Western European countries to handle?
This is actually a potentially very, very crucial week, and one of the more crucial we've had in quite a long time, even since Trump has come into office. There are some really important meetings between the United States, Ukraine, and Europe in London tomorrow. And then there's going to be some U.S. and Russia meetings following that. And Trump put out on his Truth Social last night that he thinks within the next 3 days that he thinks he can have some kind of a deal wrapped up. I'm thinking it's more like the first version you said, that the end result of all these conversations is going to be I'm washing my hands and moving on, because the sides are still so far, far apart. Even the U.S. and the Western side are far apart. But then from where anybody in the West wants to go and where Russia wants to go are certainly not something you can bridge in 3 days. For example, one of the things that the Ukraine side wants us to say, all right, we'll concede this 20% of the territory where the line of contact is, but only, I think they call it de facto, not de jure, which they define as meaning we'll say, yes, you occupy this, but we will not publicly acknowledge that it's your territory, etc. Russia said it is our territory. It's already in our constitution. It's not even up for debate, so they would not agree to that. Then, of course, you get into the bigger issues of, where will those lines be? Because the Ukraine side wants them to be on the line of contact, and the Russian side says the minimum we'll even talk about is the administrative borders, and there's substantial portions of the southern three of those provinces that would have to be withdrawn and evacuated by the Ukraine side. I can't see them agreeing to any of that. So if Trump is true that he wants to have this wrapped up in 3 days, then almost the only way he can do that is to wash his hands and walk away.
So it seems, I don't want to call it comical, but you talk de facto and de jure. De jure, of course, by law, ergo the formal movement of the border to recognize this is now part of Russia, as opposed to de facto, which is really what it was before, with the vast majority of the population in these regions already feeling more loyal to Russia than they did to Ukraine. So that situation existed before Russia invaded to sort of liberate, if I may use that word, these territories, right?
Well, yeah, and then that really kind of gets to the heart of why I think that the only play that Trump can have here is to say, all right, we gave you guys every opportunity we could, but we're walking. Because even with all of the combat realities you and I talk about every week we get together that are irrevocably on the Russian side, even to this day, the Western side still cannot come to recognize that. And they think that they can actually tell the Russian side where the line's going to be, what the conditions are going to be, et cetera, when all those cards are on the Russian side. And so I think that you're going to get to the point to where Trump is like faced with the reality, the de jure, the de jure, if you want to get to that one, that they're irreconcilable. And so the only option is y'all figure it out, and that means y'all fight it out. And I think that's just the harsh truth of it, because they will not come to a recognition of combat reality.
Well, and we've had this conversation before. If it comes to that, and we basically effectively pull the plug and say, "Hey, we're done. You guys deal with it on your own." Our NATO allies don't have the capacity to do that. I mean, I don't think the population itself is willing to go put itself on the line to fight for Ukrainian independence from Russia, or to try to liberate these Russian-dominated regions in Ukraine. I mean, do they have the will? That's one question. But then the second component is that we've talked about before. Do they have the military hardware to do it? And I get the impression that they do not. I mean, they're starting to rebuild their armies as we speak, but they're way behind the curve on that.
Yeah, I mean, let's start with the second part of that first. The capacity, without question, there is not, because Russia has spent really the first, say, 2.5 years to 2+ years retooling their industry, building up their armed forces, building up their capacity to do all these things that they need to do, reorienting their economy so that they can sustain this. And now then they are on a steady state to where they can maintain this force. They have now about 1.5 million active army alone, 2 point something total active forces when you add in the Air Force and the Navy. and the industry can sustain this level of fighting for indefinitely, which grossly exceeds anything the cumulative West in its entirety, to include the United States, can even come close to matching. They can't. And to your second point about the political will, it simply doesn't exist. Everybody, or many people, let me put it that way, in the West ideally would like Russia to lose and would like Ukraine to win. But if it costs them something, if they have to shed their blood, if they have to send their boys, it's 0%.
Yeah. And it makes me think of something like Vietnam, a lot of resistance to that. Why are we in this remote region in Asia, and why are we fighting for their population? It has nothing to do with us. We're not connected with them. It befuddled a lot of people. And I know there were a lot of people, the big supporters of it, because that was back when we were fighting the communists, the Red Scourge. But it's amazing. We ultimately become a trading partner with Vietnam after all those years. Anyhow, the absurdity of war. Are we learning anything? I know my observation on this, considering the overwhelming amount of military might that Russia has, the overwhelming numbers relative to the soldiers that are on the ground, it has taken them a long time. I think Russia thought they'd just roll in and it'd be over in no time. Have we learned something from this about Russia's ability to wage war, given the size of Ukraine relative to the size of the Russian army? Or is this providing us with valuable information?
Let me tell you something that's not entirely good or kind or optimistic. But after World War II, we learned a great deal. And our policymakers across the board in Western Europe recognized the reality of balance of power forces and what was and what wasn't possible. And our policies matched reality. And we got the best deal we could given the circumstances. And we kept that steady state peace for, during the entirety of the Cold War. And we didn't take actions that were unnecessarily provocative. We showed a definite strength so that it would deter the other side from doing anything. And that kept the peace for a long time. We have forgotten those lessons. And now then, despite what we have observed with well over 1 million people being killed and proving again the reality of the balance of power dynamics, we still have refused, as a cohort in the West, we've refused to acknowledge that, and we're still pretending it's otherwise. And that very often leads to bad policy decisions that can't be accomplished and don't lead to peace. I hope it doesn't come to that. And that's one of the reasons I'm hopeful that Trump's willingness to do that may force feed these guys to do something that gets the war off the table. And if it doesn't, if they act even more foolish, without the United States, they could plunge themselves into a war that could go nuclear all too easily.
Oh, geez. Well, we don't get to end on a happy note today, Daniel Davis, but got to speak it out loud to point out what reality is like as we stare at this conflict. Daniel Davis Deep Dive, always a real pleasure having you on the 55 KRC Morning Show. I encourage my listeners to check out online and